Hello, congratulations. You have made it to Module 3. Now we are ready to tackle poetry. And as I was putting together the module for this course, I had to take a couple of deep breaths because what you all have to get through in a week is what in a typical semester we would spend at least 3 weeks on. So this is very compressed, and we really have to sort of just take a high level view of this introduction to poetry. So hopefully this is the first step on a longer journey into the study of poetry for you. But please don't think that we'll be able to be comprehensive. So what I want to do in this short lecture is just kind of give you that bird's eye view, sort of a big picture, a couple of thoughts on poetry, and then hone in on just a few of the most important technical features that we'll be looking at. And then hopefully that deep dive into those couple of features might give you more confidence if those are the things you choose to write about in your response. So first and foremost, poetry obviously is one of our oldest forms of literature. And dates back to pre-literate cultures, right? So we've had poetry in our lives probably as long as we've had language. And poetry within the last 100 years or so has undergone some really dramatic shifts. And I think it's also important to keep a very broad view of what we define as poetry. So one of the great things about Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize in Literature is a reminder that how ubiquitous poetry really is if you broaden it to think about it encompassing songs, song lyrics, hip hop, all of these different musical forms that we have. And when you think about songwriting as very similar craft to what poets do, hopefully, one, it makes it more accessible to you because you may not ever sit down and read a slender little volume of poetry put out by an elite press, but odds are you are listening to songs and lyrics and music all the time. So I think one of the important things to remember about poetry and the big shift that we are making now is to turn away from storytelling. So we were looking at the elements of narrative in the short stories that we read in the first 2 units. And now we're moving away from that and looking at a different way to communicate through literature, and that we're communicating something different. So certainly there is narrative poetry. We look back to the great epic tradition, poems like Beowulf or the Canterbury Tales. Those are stories put to verse, right? Written in poetic form. But particularly in the 20th century, we've really moved away from that narrative kind of form. And sometimes going back and reading those old narratives can be a bit of a chore because we're not used to diving into a poetic form for that long. So instead, I think that poems really serve a different function for us now, in that they get to truth through our emotional experience and through close observations of moments in time. So rather than trying to always put a beginning, middle, and end onto experience, poems kind of try to capture either maybe something that's very singular and finite, or sometimes, I think when they're most effective, they take that singularity and that kind of perfect moment and help broaden it out or blow it up into the much more universal, relatable kinds of experiences. So I think when we're reading poems, one thing that is important for me is to really listen carefully to my own reaction to the poem. So what kind of emotions does it bring up? Most excitingly, I think, or most delightfully, when does the poem spark unexpected emotions, things that I wasn't necessarily planning for? So working through our reactions to poems, and as I've put up here right on the screen, the ebook, just to sort of take you through what I'm expecting you to read in these first 3 chapters, Chapter 11 is a very short chapter that kind of reinforces this high-level experience about poetry. And one of the things that it emphasizes, that I also want to emphasize, just as we did with short stories, that this is not an exercise in code breaking. So we're not trying to find, the specific universal significance of a symbol, and that's going to unlock this static or stable meaning within a poem, right? So it's not, it's not code breaking. We're not trying to solve a riddle or a puzzle when we read poetry. And what gives it life and keeps it going through the centuries is the fact that so many different people may have different responses. So certainly we do have a kind of sort of an acceptable boundary, I think, to interpretation, right? We can't go with just any off-the-wall thing and say, oh, well, that's what the poem means to me. We do have to ground our reactions in the actual poem. But there's a huge range within that of experience that we can have and of interpretation. And I think that's what's really exciting when we're looking at poetry. So chapter 11 kind of reminds you of that. Chapter 18 gets into the sounds of poetry. And so I'm going to take us over there just to talk very quickly about a couple of things. Rhyme, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. This is the end rhyme, right, is a sort of classic marker of a poem. As you see in this example from Thomas Hardy, crown and town, those are rhyming words. Tie, tea, prosperity, and she, socks, docks, 3, she, right? So end rhyme you should be very familiar with. Then what, particularly in the late 19th into the 20th century, we start seeing this more and more with poets like Emily Dickinson. As we break from really rigid forms of poetry into what we call free verse, we see much more slant rhyme. And so slant rhyme, sometimes it's also called half rhyme or near rhyme, is that the words are similar, but something is just a little bit different. And the textbook gives us 2 nice examples. So the word all and bowl both have the L sound, right? But the vowel sound is just a little off. So that would be a slant rhyme. So if a poet stacked those 2 words in places where we would expect rhyme, it kind of jerks us out of our complacency or makes us sort of slow down and ponder things because it's just slightly off from what our brain is expecting. It can also happen with consonants, so we could have the vowels sound the same, but the consonant sounds be slightly off, like the words dark and heart. So the vowel sound there is the same, but we have the k and the t sounds that differ slightly. So slant rhyme, I think, is something really useful to hone in on and might definitely be something that you want to talk about in your response to a poem. All right, the other thing, I'm going to try not to get too bogged down. And as I said in the instructions, these chapters give you a ton of poems. Don't feel that you need to read every word of every poem. I've pointed you really clearly to the poems that you need to look at more carefully for your quizzes and your assignment, but otherwise, these are just here to sort of help you explore the concepts, read as you wish. So don't feel like you have to read every word of every poem. All right, the other thing we need to talk about is meter. So let's look at poetic meter. So poems can be written in very specific forms. And these forms often relied on syllable count. So a single line of a poem would have a certain amount of syllables. And then those syllables would be coupled into specific patterns of stressed and unstressed beats or rhythms. And then that's what gives us sort of the musical sense or the song of a poem. Now, some of this worked very, very well in Latin, which is where a lot of these, and Greek, where a lot of these forms come from, but make it a little more challenging in English. However, English is what we call a stress-timed language, which means we space out the timing of our speech based on specific stresses of syllables. So we can actually cram a whole bunch of syllables into a single timing, different from like Italian or French, for example. So for example, I could say cat chases dog. I'm going to say that in the same amount of time as I'm going to say the cat has been chased by the dog, right? Because we cram all those little words, those little unstressed words in, but we time our language off of those stressed beats. So I'm not going to go through all the meters. You'll see them here in your textbook, but I do want to emphasize that iambic pentameter is the most kind of favored or common meter in English poetry for centuries. And Shakespeare, for example, writes an iambic pentameter all the time. So he's writing sonnets that have, that means every line of his 14-line syllables, or poems, sorry, are 10 syllables each, and then they come in a unstressed, stressed pattern, right? And then he also writes in blank verse, which is again iambic pentameter, but unrhymed. So many of the great soliloquies, to be or not to be, right, for example, are written in iambic pentameter, to be or not to be, right? If we overemphasize, then we can usually hear the pattern very clearly. So that's iambic pentameter. So pentameter means it has 5 feet. Each foot has 2 syllables. So that gives us 10 syllables in the line. And then each foot is an iamb. So it's an unstressed and then a stressed beat. Okay. So those are kind of the big things, rhyme and meter, that really set apart poetry from other forms of literature and things you want to pay closer attention to as you're reading through the textbook. The other thing is external forms. So I just gave one, for example, the sonnet, and we're going to talk about another in your close reading of Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina. So there are specific kind of famous forms that poets have long used and still use and kind of play with up to today. So again, you don't need to memorize every single form, but you do want to kind of take a quick overview of that chapter and then refer back to that chapter for the quiz as you're looking for the definitions of specific forms. All right, so I hope that that high-level introduction to poetry is useful for you and that you enjoy this module.